All right, you got 5 o'clock and you're live.
All right, thank you. This is the Planning Committee, September 27th, 2021. I'll do a roll call first. Councilmember Davies.
Here.
Councilmember Carson.
Here.
Councilmember Drenick.
Here.
And Councilmember Risberger, I'm here. Did everybody get a chance to look at the minutes from our last meeting, which was not August 30th, it was July 26th? Any questions, concerns about the, okay. All right, so we have 2 topics on the agenda tonight so far. And the first one is regarding the basketball fence or a basketball fence in Wilbur Park.
Yep.
So I'm going to turn this over to Councilmember Davies, who put this on the agenda.
So I think may have been the July meeting, maybe it was the June meeting. There was some concern from the Wilbur Park neighbors about the basketball court. So you remember we had that whole discussion. Greg spent a lot of time getting out there and looking at things, and we went ahead and we addressed some of their concerns, didn't take down some trees. One of the things that came out of that was the idea of having some kind of visual barrier between the neighbors that are directly next to the new basketball court and the basketball court itself. So you all asked me to touch base with folks and to try to figure out what was most acceptable or they were most interested in. There were 3 options. I guess there was 4. Do nothing was a 4th, but the 3 options that were presented were screening, some type of hedge or natural barrier that would grow up over time, and a stockade fence. So I brought those towards some of the folks that were most impacted by this or most upset about this. And what I heard across the board with no exceptions was they think the screening would work well, certainly as an immediate type of answer to this, with the idea of down the road beginning to put in some type of natural hedge or something like this.
Can I stop you for a second?
Yep.
What do you mean by screening? Like, can you?
So as I understand it, Greg, you can probably best answer it. It was the type of screening we actually have on some of the courts now, right? That's kind of a
privacy/windscreen kind of thing.
So it's you can kind of see through it, but it's not that you're looking straight onto a court. So it's just kind of a screen. If you look down the courts now, kind of running from east to west on the 2 different courts, is that screening between the courts.
So it's attached to the chain link. It just makes it so it's not that see-through. It's like
Okay, is it like a nylon type screen or?
yeah, nylon vinyl, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the most inexpensive option of the options that were put forward. So that they thought that would work rather well. And then they were interested in some kind of natural planting, but they did have a little caveat there, is that they wanted the environmental board to be involved in that in terms of finding something that was not an invasive species, something that would kind of work well or was indigenous to this area. And so that was the concern. So just relaying that information, you all asked me to go out and collect it, and that was what was discussed.
I think one of the options was like a 2A, 2B sort of an option, which was to have the fence and the natural screening by way of shrubbery be concurrently installed, so that the shrubbery would grow even as the fence was installed.
Right. I think that's exactly what they were looking at. Absolutely. I mean, with the idea of fully understanding that you put something in the ground, it's going to take a while before it's matured to the point that it's a visual barrier. But in the meantime, that the privacy screen would do fine.
How long of a distance are we talking about for a natural barrier that we need?
I don't know. I'd have to kind of probably go out there and walk a little more to figure out. I mean, Greg, what do you think? Maybe
Well, how about this? How many properties are we talking? Are we talking 2, 3, 5?
probably talking the length of
150 feet for hedgerow, what we got figured.
yeah.
So if you were looking at like juniper trees, for instance, where they might grow to be 20 feet, is that too tall? And they grow, I think it'd be about 6 feet wide. So that you'd almost have something like a hedge. What's the other one? I think,
Did you just say arborvitae?
yeah, that's the other one as well. I said juniper, but yeah, those are trees that we've got planted, but yeah, the arborvitae, they're very popular and they grow tall and not as wide.
Well, I think what our job is going to be is really deciding what we want to do, what the city should do based on cost and aesthetics. We can let the environmental board, if we decide we want a natural barrier and go that route, we'd let the environmental board bring something forward that they think will work. Because I'm sure there's a million things out there that could be used, I'm sure. But we want something that's going to stay, grow relatively quickly, look right, look nice. Barberry bushes work real well, but I don't think we want to rely on those. So, I mean, what's everybody's thought between the three choices then? Well, the screen and hedge sort of go hand in hand, but are we all thinking the stockade fence is too much?
Yeah, I would agree that it is.
Okay.
I think that was the most expensive option, if I recall correctly.
The stockade fence we had around 5,000, hedgerow 6,200,
Oh.
privacy screen 2,430.
Okay, now strike that.
Well, the hedgerow was based on what though?
Installing 150-foot long hedgerow with 43 arborvitae trees, 3 to 5 foot tall install, mature height 6 to 15 feet. Honestly, depending on the species and what the cost difference might be, that might change one way or the other.
Well, maybe if we're all in agreement that the stockade fence is not appropriate,
Right.
regardless of cost, because I'm getting that impression.
Yeah.
But if we go to the environmental board, let the environmental board make recommendations of what should be used as a natural barrier, bring that back, and then we can talk to engineering about getting a more definite cost estimate on what they're recommending. Or isn't it going to matter? No matter what they recommend, it's going to be about that.
I wonder too about the idea of a fence that's used as more of a trellis, something that you could have, rather than having bushes or trees planted, we use the actual fence. In the first year, you'd want to have that screen, certainly. But if that isn't something that maybe some growing vines or something that might be more natural to look at, and have the fence essentially provide the structure for it, if that wouldn't be a kind of a less expensive way about.
You're talking about stockade fence?
No, not stockade. No, stockade, I think is not the way to go here, but this is off of a chain link fence, correct? The
The windscreen would go on the actual chain link fence, which is
Mhm.
the edge of the court.
Yeah.
So stockade fence or a fence like you're talking about will be a new fence along the property line or stuff.
What's the distance from the property line to the fence?
20 feet,
Okay.
30 feet, probably actually. 20, 30.
Yeah, so then it would be a new fence.
Yeah, okay.
But you can't put that on the basketball fence. Can't have something grow on the basketball fence, because that'll be problematic.
Right.
Probably end up having the similar problems that we had before with the surface.
I think some of the thinking behind the neighbors with regards to stockade fences, they do enjoy accessing the park right out their backyard.
Right.
So I think that's something that they're interested in continuing, but just visually having a little bit more of a sight line removed from the basketball court is kind of what they're most interested in. So I don't know how many, what'd you say, 43 trees, what kind of, openings that creates. I guess I don't really have an understanding of how big and how much they need to be spread apart, but I think we should keep that in our thinking as well.
Because if they're actually looking to have best of both worlds, where they still have access through their property into the park, we wouldn't necessarily want a full solid hedgerow either.
It'd be easy enough just to leave some.
Yeah, which would cut down on cost. So yeah, Len.
So Mark, that's what I did. I just took basically 150 divided by 42 and it came up to 1.19. So if we space them out just a little bit more, we could save costs. I think you just said there's $6,200 for the vegetation. By no means my vegetation expert. It just seemed that like that was really close, a foot apart.
I think it'd be more than that, 40, 50 goes into 153 times, so. I mean, yeah, they'd be pretty tight. This is creating a real privacy screen.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that the neighbors wanting to have passage through, and they were they just wanted a vegetation breakup, correct? And if I understand this correctly, we're putting the screening on the outside of the fence that's already there. So that's 25 feet away from the property line, correct? So they're not actually going to see the individuals playing basketball. I think the vegetation was maybe for sound. I don't know. I don't know what
Well,
we
it's
were.
an alternative, so to do both is
Right.
unnecessary as far as the visual screen goes, but I think this visually, you're gonna stop
Right.
that with just a screen, but if you do want some sort of, I think the noise is also an issue, and I think the vegetation might help. more so.
It might, although I haven't heard any complaints since the basketball's been in there, so.
What was the cost on the screen again?
We heard one
Oh, you did?
from a neighbor.
Dave, I think it was like $2,200.
How much?
Is that one of the ones that had been involved in that concerns earlier on? 'Cause it didn't come to me.
She called, woman called.
There was a concern this weekend, if you're referencing that.
This was.
This was up on the upper area.
On the corner of 30 Robinson.
Okay.
We had a concern about loud music and inappropriate language.
Okay. That didn't come to me.
Okay, so are we all in agreement that we're looking to do the screen and some sort of natural barrier? Or do we want to get,
I wouldn't mind going with the screening for this year through next year. Develop a track plan. Obviously, Greg is right on top of it. Any complaints, kind of get a feedback, and then if we need to address this next year, but at least we're cutting down the visual, which I think was the number one complaint or possibility.
One of them, noise was the other concern. Noise was the primary concern.
If we had the environmental board, though, nonetheless, take a look at what the appropriate plantings might be, we get that kind of figured out, then we'd have some sort of a price point to be working with as well.
yeah, because I think the screen's not going to be enough. I think we're still going to there'll be complaints based on the sound. And there's of course, no natural barrier is going to be perfect to limit any sound traveling from the.
And the aesthetics of the plantings, I mean, that's not, without
Right.
merit.
So why don't we don't need to decide on anything right now, but should we have the environmental board contact Greg, find out what specifically will be what they recommend as a barrier, and then we can come up with a better price point, because Greg will know like how much of what they're recommending we're really going to need, and then we can get a better price point. So,
Sure, I can bring that back to them, although I have representatives here. Here's two of them are here.
Goal of including that, whatever the cost is in the budget request.
Okay, say again.
Should I go about this with the idea that this will be a 2022 expense? So we include in our budget requests at this point, basketball.
yeah, because then it could
By the
be,
time
if we decide we're going to do
start-
plantings, we could do the plantings next year. We probably shouldn't do plantings this year anyway, at this point, since we're almost to October.
Yeah, I would say so. In my estimation.
Greg, I'm just looking up on my phone. Is there any soundproofing that we can provide screening and some kind of sound deadening on the chain link fence around the basketball?
I'm aware of.
I think it would probably be something that's
Separate structure.
probably is, but it would be cost prohibitive is what I'm thinking.
Well, what's our budget right now, Dave? 6,200 for vegetation and 2,200 for this visual.
Probably, yeah. But if we do plantings, we're talking less maintenance too. And we could even have an agreement with the neighbors that if we're doing the plantings, that they do the maintenance. So. And we wouldn't necessarily need to replace the screen if the screen eventually deteriorates on the fence, if the natural barrier is grown enough.
I was just thinking, although I'm wrong, that probably soundproofing as a fence is going to require baffles, and that's going to wind up being something that's a maintenance issue. But looking at what Len's got there,
I have something out there. It's called. Brutalize that one.
Acoustic fence.
Patent, noise reducing fence, the right material. So it's simple to install, outdoor acoustical barrier, the UV and most resilient qualities. Make it uniquely suited to outside.
it's nice looking too.
It's actually black.
Yeah, it's a nice looking fence.
Is it the distance far enough away? Because I haven't been on the properties to see. But if we did that, is the distance far enough away that we wouldn't then be getting a complaint saying, well, we didn't want a stockade fence, but you essentially put up a stockade fence, what, 20 feet away from my edge of my property? And I'm just putting it out there because I think we should look at this from all angles.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I would think that would need to be a discussion point, folks. This has been they've been really hot about this summertime. I think I'd like to have a conversation with them if we were going to go in that direction. I don't know what's more important to them, not hearing it or the visual.
okay. Well, I don't think there's any reason why we can't go two different directions. You want to talk, if you want to talk with the neighbors. In the meantime, the environmental board can discuss what they think would be a natural, the best type of natural plantings, or come up with a couple options, and then discuss that with Greg, and then we all reconvene at our next meeting. So, and if the neighbors have no issue with that, and that turns to be the cheapest option, then we could potentially go that direction.
Yeah, I'd suggest though that, I don't know what the price point is on installation of this, but it's a nice looking fence that should probably be something that these folks have an opportunity to see. It doesn't present itself like a stockade fence does. They might find it attractive.
I would just.
So it might be
wanna-
something, Len, you can just share with folks.
Yeah, just the only thing that would be something else to consider are legacy costs on something like that.
Yeah.
All right, do we have anything else on that one, that topic? Okay. Then let's go ahead and move on to the environmental board creek naming proposal. And
So thanks for hearing this. So I'm the liaison with the environmental board, and we have largely a newish or pretty new environmental board. And they have come in pretty excited about this particular project and some of the potential here. So without trying to give you all the background on that, I'll certainly turn this over to Paul and Mike, who can kind of explain to you kind of what the idea, the proposal is, what the thinking is, and also why they're here to bring this up. So I'll turn over to you guys.
Yeah, so we don't have any formal presentation plan, but just basically on the environmental board, we've been talking about how we can encourage stewardship of natural areas in the city of Oneonta and more broadly in Otsego County. And with the concept that once people feel more familiar with natural areas and more aware of them, more educated about them, they'll be more likely to help take care of them. So I don't honestly remember where this idea came from initially, but we started realizing that there are a number of natural features in the city and town of Oneonta that are unnamed, particularly small creeks, hilltops, and islands, and islands in the Susquehanna. And so we came to the decision that creeks seemed like the best place to start. And if this is successful, maybe in future years, we would look at some other features. But we talked about, in our opinion, what would be the best way to go about having a public process that would create publicly supported names for these little creeks. There are half a dozen little creeks in the city and 2 that are in the town that are crossing the city that are just at the borders. And our proposal is to work primarily with the schools and get kids involved in visiting the creeks, do an environmental education project. Some of Paul's students at SUPO can be involved in doing science education. And having the schools generate a brainstorm of names, and then there's could be a more broad public component. We haven't figured that out. We would love your input on that. But then the top ranked names would eventually come to the council. The official governmental process is that USGS has a body which is in charge of officially approving new names. And usually if some member of the public comes to them, then they send it back to the local unit of government. So I contacted them and they said, yes, by all means, the best way to do it is have the public and the local unit of government, together approve a new name, which would then get forwarded to USGS. And at that point, if the city supports it, it's just bureaucratic, basically, for them to rubber stamp it. The other thing we talked about was thinking about what kinds of names we would want to encourage the students or others to name. And we were quickly thinking about things that either were just descriptive names or were sort of visually descriptive or geographically linked to the actual creeks. USGS also supports names that are tied historically to people who have had some kind of role historically, land ownership or other role in that area. USGS generally discourages memorial names that are somebody who's not, not connected to Oneonta or even specifically to that part of Oneonta. What else do we need to talk about, Paul?
It's a creek naming project. It's largely Michael's brainchild. He has a map in front of him on his computer here where he's done a lot of mapping and identifying where these creeks are. There's 6 or 7 of them. Some of them are really small. They're like 1.5 miles long or a half a mile long. They're the kind of creeks that you don't even notice when you're driving around town. So for example, if you're going up East Street and you go past the high school entrance, there's a little creek right there. You can't even tell that it goes underneath East Street. There's a little creek right there. I think that's the one that comes out of Union Pond. So these are just small little creeks. And the idea is to engage kids, middle school, elementary, middle school, and high school kids, probably find a creek that is in close proximity to each of the schools. This creek would be assigned to like that school. We talk with teachers to see if they were interested in engaging some kids or even a class of kids in like an environmental stewardship, a couple of lessons. I do run the science education program at Oneonta, and perhaps some of the science education students could play a role in this. They could learn about the geology, the fauna, flora, and natural history, come up with a name that is appropriate. And like I described, there is an approval process where such name could ultimately be the name that you see on the map. It's, as you opened, it would be, it'd be a thing that would generate a connection to where people live.
And then the second part of this, which is not explicitly in this proposal, but that we would hope would happen in the future is, some areas do a good job of putting signs on bridges or on other, creek crossings, identifying creeks. And I think Oneonta could move in that direction, especially for the bigger creeks that are already named, but perhaps also for these smaller creeks. So yeah, as Paul said, the longest creek is one that's about 3 miles long that starts sort of behind Walgreens and goes through the valley, like through the former rail yard, out eventually to Oneida Street, and then curves down into the Susquehanna. There's a big sort of wetlands pond out there behind Oneida Street. So that's connected. Its headwaters is at sort of Cliff Street, sort of back behind Walgreens. So that's the biggest of the creeks. One question that we have for you guys in terms of city-town coordination is that as we looked at the map and looked at which creeks made most sense to assign to specific schools, two of the creeks, the creek that's closest to Greater Plains is the creek that actually goes through the Greater Plains schoolyard, but that creek is almost entirely in the town of Oneonta. So I don't know whether it's better. I mean, we as the environmental board, we're a city of Oneonta committee. We have no official responsibility for the town of Oneonta, but we're happy to go to the town and present this idea to them, or that could come from the city council if that made more sense. Likewise, the creek that's closest to Valley View Elementary is also the one that goes kind of past the Fox Care Clinic, which is also mostly, but not entirely, in the town.
Questions you have?
So, Michael, the process would be that the schools would be solicited first, or to make sure that there's actually buy-in to
Right.
the project?
They know nothing about this.
Yes, we've talked informally with a couple teachers, but we were waiting to talk to you guys first before and make sure that we addressed any of your concerns before we launched it anyway and started talking to principals.
And then the city-town coordination, which I think is really cool, actually, such a benign thing for everybody to be engaged in. How do you see that beginning, that process?
We are happy to go present. I think after we've talked to the schools, we're happy to go and address the town board and talk to them about the idea and see if they're interested in participating. If they're not participating, we can still do it with creeks that are just within the city of Oneonta. It'll just be a little less convenient because the creek that's next to Greater Plains won't be part of it, and the kids will have to go somewhere else.
Well, I think it makes sense, in my opinion, to present this to the town board, just to get buy-in from them on this. I think it's a great idea. I don't see any downside to this. I think it could be a little bit tricky with a couple creeks that run between the town and the city, but I think it's just a matter of we come up with what the kids decided they wanted and have some a discussion between both boards and have simultaneous legislation along with the other legislation we need to have. I mean, at this point, this would be a project that the environmental board would be taking on with the schools, then I take it.
Right.
So, do we need to have any specific vote on this, Gary? At the council level?
Well, the actual naming is always the council's prerogative. I mean,
Right.
the council can rename anything in the city. Apparently, in this case, Michael has researched, so we'd have to get USGS stamp of approval, but I think that would be
But we don't need to do a vote to
But-
initiate this.
the only reason to vote to initiate it is to make sure you don't get all the way down the road with this, and then you have a name and the council is going to approve the name, and then the council says, wait a minute, we don't support this. Just to make sure you have the council's support as going forward, but I doubt that anybody would not support this.
Right, there's.
It's a great idea, and I don't see any downsides to it.
There's always a possibility of a controversial name, and if the kids want to name something Spider-Man Creek, then the council should feel free to say, thanks for your hard work, why don't you go back and come up with another suggestion. I think it's a great opportunity for the kids to learn a little bit about civics and how local government works as well.
I mean, ultimately, every name would have to be approved by the council, unless the council was to pass some type of a resolution now authorizing some other body to make the name. So whatever names come up, if a name comes up that's controversial and appropriate, the council will likely discuss that and not approve it.
So Mayor, your first suggestion was that we approve or support a process for naming, and then that final name would then be brought to the council. We would then approve that name, and then environmental board would work with USGS to get that approved. So we would be possibly approving a process. that would be-
Yeah, I think that the environmental board should actually spell out the process that you see, how it usually work. Submit that the council approve that process, and then when names come up, the council can approve each name individually, and which would be kind of nice because the student or students who came up with those names could be here at the meeting for the approval. They could even get some kind of a certificate of recognition. Be nice recognition for the students.
So I sent a proposed process that came from the environmental board out to everybody Saturday morning, afternoon. So I don't know if anyone had a chance to look at that. I think I got you in there as well, Mayor.
On the other side of the piece of paper.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, the devil's advocate question would be if the city council, if our common council votes to approve a name of a creek that runs also through the town, then the town would also, I would suppose, be approving that name. So there need to be some sort of level of coordination.
Well, the coordination could be the environmental board,
Yes.
where once we know, like at Greater Plains, what the kids have decided is the name they want, the resolution or the motion that goes forward could be presented both to the town and the city, I would assume. And I think just to avoid embarrassment, I think we should all have a conversation behind the scenes to make sure that we approve it, or it will be approved. So we don't have like Spider-Man Creek approved by the city, but not the town.
And that's
For
the
example.
workflow that I'd like to think that we see that so that we know that we don't wind up embarrassed.
Yeah.
Paul and Mike, thank you very much for coming before us today, and this is a great idea, and obviously you've already put a lot of work into this. I think the only question I have is, do we meet the definition of by USGS standards of what a body of water is? Does it have to have a static water source in order to name it a creek? Because I'm looking at the list that you proposed here. Hunt Union Pond at SUNY campus going 0.5 miles to Oneonta Creek. And then if I understand 4 and 5 together, isn't that the same creek, or am I misunderstanding that?
No, that's on the other side of the valley. So there's like one that flows around past the middle school and one that flows next to.
Oh, you're talking about on the back side.
Yeah.
Oh,
Like Meadowbrook, is that the name of that road? That flows down into
I got you.
by the.
Apologize. Yeah, gotcha. So yeah, that's the only question I had was, does those bodies of water that you're identifying, do they meet the definition of USGS standards for naming?
I read briefly through the like 600-page manual of USGS standards, and I can't definitively answer your question, but I'll get back to you. My understanding is basically USGS will support naming any geographic feature, and there's a preference. It's much more cumbersome process to rename something when something doesn't have a known name. It's more straightforward. And yeah, and they have a group of archaeologists and geologists and so on who do some, well, can support us in doing some investigation, and maybe we can even get the kids connected to them in terms of researching the natural history of the area. But I can't definitively answer your question. I'll let you know.
We had actually joked about that earlier. We had joked about that we're engaging kids in the process of naming creeks that you could like just straddle like to like
Right.
tiny things. So
Right.
each of them, July or something there.
Right. I mean, they do need to be natural features. There was a case, I read through the minutes of this USGS board. A college professor in Illinois had his students recommend names for local features. And then it became a political issue because they didn't work with the local government. Just the students just like went straight to USGS. But one of the things they tried to name were basically the concrete little artificial islands in their equivalent of Huntington Pond. Like they tried to name those as islands, and the USGS said, no, those aren't islands. It's like a storm sewer.
The power of you.
But as long as it's natural features, my understanding.
Okay. Thank you.
So it sounds like we're in agreement that we like the idea, and we're asking the environmental board to go back and bring forward a motion for us, a resolution. Would a resolution or more
I
motion?
just think if they have finalized your proposal, it sounds like you're almost there. Finalize your proposal, and then we can just write a motion to approve the proposal.
Including the vetting, the whole vetting process.
I think Judy's got something to add.
And you have to sit, after the names are approved by everybody, including USGS, what's the process after that for getting them on the maps? Would you guys contact the county and, GIS mapping and stuff? Because that is the next step, right? To make sure they're all on current mapping.
Yeah, once USGS has approved it, it becomes, they have I think it's a quarterly update of GIS data, I believe that. So, it may take it depends how often the county updates their map to actually update it, but we can certainly encourage them to do that so that it shows up in the map. But, Google Maps pulls from the same database and so on, so.
Right. Good question. Okay, we have anything? Oh, sure, Judy, go ahead.
Since this is all Susquehanna, do you have to contact the Susquehanna Recreation Commission? Or is it just through USGS?
I actually don't know.
I just know they're so strict on everything else. I didn't know if they were on their tributary names.
I will look into that.
What was that group again?
Susquehanna River Basin Commission.
Don't they have a pretty robust grant program also for schools and students?
I don't know about Susquehanna. Do you guys know?
Maybe I'm thinking of the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Commission that
Yeah,
has it.
they were trying, I know they were trying to get a really robust funding program for like infrastructure, wastewater and water plants. And it never happened from here. I don't know if the southern states
Right.
have better, funding programs or not. And relative to education, I don't know.
Okay, I just wonder if there was an opportunity there to pair that with, the schools or something like that in terms of doing some of that research and.
They probably reach out to them.
All right, do we have any other questions for the environmental board?
Again, thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks
guys.
for your work on this, and we look forward to your finalized proposal for us.
Sounds good. We will, I think probably the process is at this point, we will get in touch with all the schools and discuss it at our next environmental board meeting and then forward to a proposal.
Sounds good.
All right.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Yeah,
guys.
thank you, guys.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Paul.
At this point, do we have anything that anybody else wants to discuss and bring forward? Mark?
Yeah, I've just got more of a process question. A couple of streets that residents have expressed concern about pedestrian safety. The corner of Church and Chestnut, and the what we call crash corner up on West Street by Hartwick. And I'm wondering whether or not yield to pedestrian signs might be something that, as I'm looking at all the various options, stop signs, speed bumps, and all these other, and digital signs and so forth, and they all seem like they've got an inherent number of issues with them. But I'm wondering about the yield to pedestrian sign as maybe being something that might achieve something along the lines of what's necessary in terms of people being more aware of pedestrians in those places, and what the process is for that. Is that something that should run through here, or Greg, is that something that should run through you to other powers that be?
Well, I think what you have just done, advise which intersections there are concerned by. You said Church and Chestnut, where the
Yeah, Church and Chestnut, yes.
pedestrian.
And West Street and
traffic
Center.
signal is?
And West Street, yes, West Street up by Hartwood College.
So Center Street or all of West Street?
It's West Street specifically at that turn. It's very difficult to know who's coming around the corner, and it's a long way from one side of Clinton Street to the other side of Clinton Street, essentially, and up above as well. And it's something that might slow down traffic there, just for the awareness of the fact that it's not like it's a heavily crossed area. Church and Chestnut is much more so, but I think they both have the same issues. I would make the argument actually that West Street is more dangerous at that curve.
I believe there are advanced warning signs there, but we could look at putting the
Yes, there are.
signs right at the crosswalk.
Yeah, and
I think at
there
one point
there
we
are
put-
mirrors even, I think, to allow people who are pulling in or pulling out to see what's what. But
At one point, we had put the in-street pedestrian signs there and they disappeared pretty quickly on West Street.
Yeah.
Back both at Harvard Drive and at Clinton. I don't think those would be appropriate at Church and Chestnut.
mhm.
I don't think so. either.
And realistically, even as a signalized intersection, the most appropriate solution would probably be looking at putting pedestrian crossing signals,
Mhm.
upgrading the signal as opposed to the signs.
At Church and Chestnut, yeah.
Greg, are there,
That's something we can-
Greg, are there other complete street type of actions that could be taken that might, in addition to signs or?
Church and Chestnut, I mean, there's not much else that I can imagine doing there as far as narrowing or traffic calming or that kind of thing. West Street also is already narrow,
Right.
relatively narrow. I think it's just that straight stretch and the nature of the traffic.
Is the downhill
They're
from
not-
one
they're
way?
through
and-
Traffic, so
Right.
you hit the gas to go over the hill there. Aside from something like a speed hump, which I wouldn't really be appropriate there, so.
Right.
I have to think more about West Street or something else.
I'll say having walked to work there for 18 years. Whew.
Perhaps some trees planted along Hartwick's property on the side, on the curb there where the houses used to be that were taken down.
I would-
Having a visual barrier or something that grows up, kind of can add to the sense
And
of
narrows
traffic calming. It's not an immediate solution, that's for sure. It's not guaranteed something.
I would suggest that if you could come back to the next meeting with some ideas and let us know what you think.
That'd be great. Yeah.
I have one quick item. It happens to be on my own street, and it was brought forward by some residents. Normal Avenue is a one-way street that intersects, comes to the top of Elm Street, and you come down Elm Street, and that first block is still a one-way heading south. And what we used to have, I mean, there's the one-way signs that are on either side of the street, which periodically shrubs overgrow those. But you can generally see them. But what's been happening more and more is we have people racing up Elm Street and they just keep going. And I witnessed it the other day, actually, with the guy delivering my newspaper, where he went by one way, delivered all his newspapers, then turned around on Elm Street and came racing back up in the opposite direction and speeding. So what used to happen was there were giant arrows painted on the street at the very top of Elm. So you could see that all the way down, blocks away. Is that something we could do as an easy way to try to give people the message? Because I think the signs, they're just not seeing them. It might be the height of them. I just don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure, those get.
Okay, great. Yeah, there were two of them and they were like, I don't know, 10 feet, 15 feet long. And
Yeah, just a post here.
yeah. Okay. Thanks. Anybody have anything else?
I would like to actually add on where Mark was, Chestnut and Watkins. There's a lot of pedestrian traffic going across there, and I don't think there's a designated crosswalk there. Could be wrong, but I don't think there is. And for years, so I mean, if this is the form that we're going to use to identify that, and also I'd like to raise several folks on Telford Street have made a suggestion of making Telford Street a one-way street because of its width and traffic patterns. So I don't know if this is the form that we're going to study one-way streets, or there's some other historical path that you guys have used.
Well, Greg's already looking at whether Potter Ave, Potter Street, Potter Ave should be a one-way street. We could add Telford into that mix. I think we've got, some of our streets are just so old and the way they were designed, it may be appropriate for them to be one way, based on traffic patterns, like you said, and safety. So I know we've had some preliminary discussions where you were going to discuss with police and fire and come back with a recommendation, but how do you feel about adding Telford to that list?
And then under complete streets, that program that you've been operating, do they identify that sidewalks are part of the future? I mean, are they pro or con sidewalks?
Complete streets, absolutely. For
Or-
sidewalks.
or-
Creating walkable communities is like the main aim of complete streets along with, like, from.
Yeah, that's how we got sidewalks up around the park at the top of Maple Street. There never was anything there until we started discussing the complete streets.
But Len, you bring up a point, and I guess I'd like to have clarification because I've had a couple of these already. How should we be addressing these types of road-specific types of concerns? Because that's probably one of the things I get most of. I mean, should we be discussing these here and planning, or should we be bringing these to Greg independently? Just curious how we should be handling that.
Well, I think anytime there's a complaint or a concern about safety, pedestrian safety or traffic issue, or whatever, if you send it to me, and I'll work with engineering and public works and maybe we bring something back to planning at the next appropriate meeting. I mean, bringing it up here is fine too, and taking it back.
Okay,
There's no
sounds
reason
good.
to wait for the next planning meeting to bring it up. You can just send it.
I would kind of advocate for bringing it up here because, one conversation leads to another and we're all sharing information about different different areas in the city that have, I had no idea about Telford, for instance, being a concern is one way, and I hadn't even thought about Watkins and Chestnut. So I think there's value in our hearing that, just in terms of our all kind of seeing the big picture of, the traffic concerns in Oneonta, and then going to you, and then you're,
Well, what we could
keeping us
do,
posted.
what I would suggest is if somebody has a question like this, like if Lena had a question about Telford and it was in between meetings, he could send it to Greg, but Greg could also contact Katie and we get it on the agenda for the next meeting. So that's brought up, even if it's at the end of the meeting. So everybody's brought up to speed about it. And then if somebody else has something else they want to add, a similar issue, that we can do it then.
Yeah, I like that.
So then we're in agreement that this will be the forum that will bring up sidewalks and streets and planning.
Yeah, it is planning.
Yeah, I don't want us to get into the nitty gritty of it because none of us are professionals in that manner, but yeah, why not? Because Greg will be here and it should be going toward DPW or the city administrator, so. Okay, anybody have anything else? All right, well, we got about 8 minutes